Hey, and welcome back. In the mix of all the various things I do within the music world, one that I really enjoy is recording in the studio and being a part of people's original music. Now, I've been recording since I was in high school, back when it was just an analog Behringer mixer, a few mics into Audacity, and then as I got into college, I learned a little bit more about multi-track recording and getting to be a part of some projects with the jazz band at the university. While I was doing that, I met Evan Middlesworth, who owned a studio in Eau Claire, and he brought me in to play on some various projects and even recorded some of my own albums. I played on a project for an artist named Tony Rongstead, and on that album, one of the other musicians who played was a gentleman named Dan Zier. A few years later, Dan asked me if I would record on his own album that he was doing at that same studio, and I agreed. But before I got a chance to actually be part of that studio session, I got a call to leave Eau Claire and join the Glenn Miller Orchestra full-time as a touring musician. So unfortunately, I was never able to play on his album. So jump forward to now, like 11 years later, and Dan reached out to me about remote recording on his next CD, which he's putting together currently. So this really starts for me with putting together a Zoom call where Dan and I could talk about the various songs, what his vision is musically, and I could walk him through my process for technically how I record drums and then how I like to work and keep lines of communication open so that we make sure what I'm doing down here ends up being in line with his vision when he hears it after I'm done recording it. I think this is super important because I don't get to leave my studio set up for one project for more than a weekend typically. During the week, I'm teaching lessons, hosting rehearsals, and I can't just have it be a mess with X drum set for whatever song I'm working on. So I kind of mentioned to Dan that I'd like to break up these 10 or 11 songs into like 3 smaller batches. So what I had him do was put together different buckets of tunes that have similar sonic palettes so that hopefully I can use the same drum set or most of the same equipment for those songs, work on them in a small bunch, send off demos for him to hear and make tweaks to, and then quickly within the next day or so I can retrack songs with changes or suggestions before putting it back to how I need it throughout the week. We had our Zoom meeting last night. I'm going to start working on this music soon, and the first batch of songs we're going to tackle don't even use full drum set necessarily, but more just percussion and emulations of a drum set across some different instruments. I'm excited to bring you along. I don't know how long it's going to take me to do this entire album, and let alone share it with you on video, but I thought it would be cool for you guys to see a real-world application of what I'm doing, even though I'm just going to be shooting all of this from my basement down here. So let's get into it. It took me almost 3 weeks to get to the point where I could start working on this first batch of songs, and that's really just a symptom of me trying to balance being studio drummer while also being an active gigging musician, private lesson instructor, and meeting a series of deadlines for the content creation work I have as well. Anyways, the first song I'm doing is a musical prelude to the whole album. It's instrumental, follows a simple 2-part form, and is only about 2 to 2.5 minutes long. Like I mentioned before, Dan talked to me about some percussion substitutes for the typical drum sounds, so I'm using a muffled floor tom to take the place of a bass drum, and a rim click for the backbeat. After getting the basic heartbeat of this rhythm tracked, I added some tambourine and some clapstack to thicken up those backbeats, and then a snare cadence for the bridge because I felt like this tune had some sort of distant march feel to it, and it creates some nice contrast. Finally, I added some cymbal swells to create a bit more drama, and when it all comes together, it sounds a bit like this. The second tune was very similar in terms of textures, so again, I have the same sort of effect with the bass drum, but then did some brushes and stick clicks for the main pulse, along with some more tambourines and cymbal scrapes to fill it out a bit. I spent maybe an hour or two tracking these couple songs, and even though it's set to be mixed much later down the road, I spent a bit of time adding things like EQ and effects because I felt like in order to share my thought behind some of these textures, it made sense to present them with a lot more of that in there. So once I had these in a more polished state, I sent over some rough mixes to Dan to see what he thought and make sure we were on the same page. So it's been like a few days since I recorded those percussion tracks, and I sent them off to Dan, heard back, and we tweaked a few things. Like, for instance, the clap stack on one of those songs, it was just too aggressive of a sound, so I went back and replaced it with a few different options for him, like woodblock, cabasa, and claves. I just sent him all those options, and he can choose whatever voicing fits best with his vision. And that's the nice part about doing percussion tracking over like a drum set is if we needed to change the snare drum, I couldn't just put in a new snare drum sample or sound. It would be in the overheads, there would be bleed. So we'd be redoing the whole song. So as we get into some of the drum set tracking, what I'm going to do today is just quick record some like scratch drum tracks to show him a demo of the parts I'm thinking. And then I'll explain some of the instrument choices I'm going to use. And I'm just going to do this with a 2 mic setup of overhead and a kick mic. This way I can quickly set it up, play drums along to the song and kind of show them where I'm playing, where I'm not, where I might add a fill. That way when I go to set up all 12 mics or whatever for the final drum tracking, I know I'm not wasting time. If we were together in a studio, this wouldn't be an issue because we would just talk through this stuff between takes. But since we're working remotely, these are some of the challenges I have to overcome, and this is some of the best ways I can see to make my time best used and most efficient. I just got off a Zoom call with Dan, and beyond those 2 scratch tracks that I showed you in the last little video segment, I was able to record 2 more songs and send them to him. I got close on a few of them with a few tweaks to the arrangement that we made, but a couple of them I was just totally off of what he was thinking. So to spend that time and take that extra step of recording a quick demo of me playing it and what I think the drum part should be and where the drum should come in and drop out, it's totally worth it in the long run, especially when you're working with musicians who don't do this every day. I think it can be really challenging for a musician who doesn't play drums as their primary instrument to vocalize what they want in a beat because it's just so different than every other instrument. Because guitar, piano, bass, they all share this same melodic foundation, but drums are really unique. So having this Zoom call we just did was super helpful, and now it's time to pick out some drums I'm going to use, at least for the first couple songs that I need to track, pick out cymbals, snare drums, and then get everything mic'd up. For this, I'm going to be using kick in, kick out, snare top and bottom, mics on all the toms, stereo overheads, a mic on the hi-hat, and at least a room mic, and maybe like a character mic, a knee mic, or a crotch mic, as some people call it. I'm not sure that the mixing engineer will need all of this, but it's worth the time for me to set it up and just track it, and then they have it. At this point, I don't really want to go back and track these songs again and set everything up if I don't have to. Now, yesterday I probably spent like close to 8 hours down here, either on my calls with Dan, picking out drums, setting up mics, doing all the technical stuff, and then actually tracking. Now, with that time, unfortunately, I only got one song done, completely good to go, wrapped up, sent off to the client. The other 3 songs still need to get done, and I'm kind of working in a methodical order of these first 2 songs use a smaller drum set, 20, 12, 14, and the last 2 songs will use slightly bigger drums. So I kind of need to get this one song done before I can go on to the final 2, or at least that's the workflow I want to do it in. With the time I had last night after I finished tracking and getting that one song completely done, I recorded more scratch drum tracks with the notes and tweaks we made to songs, and I sent those off to Dan. This morning he got back to me letting me know that like most of those are pretty much totally good to go, ready to retrack on the actual drums. I'm going to get on another quick call with Dan, talk about a few things, work out a few details, and then hopefully get to tracking right away, not having to worry about setting up and running cables. So hopefully today will be a more productive day than yesterday, and hopefully it won't take nearly as long. Finished up tracking last night, and Dan did get back to me that everything was good to go, and he's happy with this first batch of songs. So this is really like closing the door on the first 6 out of 10 tunes, but really I like to think of this as probably more like 4, because those first 2 tracks were just percussion and on their own little like micro batch, and then these 4 were the first that really utilize the drum set and require the full tracking setup. While I was doing the drum set tracking, I did most of the percussion overdubs, so you saw me do some tambourine, cowbell, shakers, whatever. That's just a lot easier to do in the moment because I'm already set up and kind of in the zone and know the phrasing and the orchestration of where I want those instruments to add in. And I can just add a track with one of the overhead mics and sit or stand at the drums and do it right there while I'm doing everything else. That also, I think, is important because when I send these files off to a client to get pre-approval of the parts, I think having some of the other layers in there to kind of show my thinking helps. Now that stuff's also super easy to mute in a verse if you don't want the tambourine there and add it in the chorus. And we're recording to a click, so theoretically they should be able to make some loops out of my playing, but typically I just track it all the way through if I can. I do have one more overdub to track, and I'm gonna do that sometime over this week, but basically, on one of the songs on the bridge, he wants to have some high-pitched toms, and we kind of settled on concert toms for this, just doing some fills in the background. And the nice part about overdubbing a small section like this is I could probably do like 3 or 4 passes. Like, here's a pass of mostly flam fills. Here's a pass that's more spacious and sporadic. Here's a pass that's a little bit busier. And we can kind of cut and paste each fill that we like for that. Other than that, now that it's Monday morning, I need to get the studio set up for teaching again, and it is a disaster zone right now. As I'm working on that stuff and swapping out cymbals, swapping out snares, using percussion instruments, I have a problem of just kind of throwing something to the nearest table or spot I can and not really putting it where it belongs. I think that's fair. That's not really something I need to fix, but I need to clean up this studio before I start teaching today. So I'm going to get that done. And then throughout this week, my goal is to do one more scratch demo of just one song, because this next song I'm going to work on has kind of like a reggae feel. and that's going to need very specific drum setups for the snare, maybe using a timbale instead of a tom, some splash cymbals. So this one's kind of an outlier, but maybe I'll be able to get that one song tracked next weekend if I'm lucky. And then we're on to the final push of just like 3 songs. So we're making some nice headway. Again, this process of sending out a scratch track to Dan to be able to give me feedback has been super helpful. Because for this reggae song, I was under the impression it was more like pseudo reggae and reggae vibes, but not too authentic. And if you're familiar with the drumming on reggae music, it's very unique, especially this one drop beat that is kind of the crux of most reggae music. And we're going to do this a little more authentic than the scratch track I just showed you. So in the spirit of doing that, I've been checking out some videos on YouTube from Art of Drumming and Reverb about recreating like the Bob Marley and the Wailers sound. And I'm going to try to give that my best go with the equipment I have here. So in addition to picking the right drums to record this song, I need to spend some extra time setting them up, meaning ditching resonant heads on almost everything, cranking the snare so it can kind of be like that timbale sound, and taking a little bit different approach with miking and muffling to really try to match the authentic sound of some traditional reggae music. So after getting a take that I thought really nailed it, I moved back over to my desk to do some cleaning up and EQ on these tracks before sending them off to Dan to see what he thinks. Once I got approval from him, I then moved on to doing some of the overdub percussion that I thought might end up on this track. I wasn't sure if we'd really need any of this, but I went ahead and did some cabasa, claves, and tambourine. And again, after I finished that, I mixed it up a little bit to send Dan the final package for this track. So it's been about 3 weeks since I last checked in, finishing up that second batch of songs. That was the beginning of December. It's now the day after Christmas. I've been really busy with a lot of lessons, makeups, and all sorts of holiday events I've been performing at, so I knew I was never really going to get into those last batch of songs until about this time. But I was always kind of targeting this week because the time between Christmas and New Year's is very slow for live gigging, other than maybe New Year's Eve. But I'm not teaching lessons, so I don't really have students coming in and out of the studio. I can just set up the space and leave it set up for an extended period of time so that if I need to do revisions on these tracks or multiple takes, I don't have to go through the process of setting everything up again. Now, over the last few weeks, I was working a little bit on some of the scratch tracks for these songs, and I went ahead and wrote charts, just knowing that the arrangements wouldn't be on my mind when I go to record if there's like a week or two in between things. So this is kind of helping me keep track of things. And for the other ones, I didn't really need that because I would work on the tracks and then like a day or two later, I'd go and do the final takes. I did some revisions with Dan, did some scratch tracks with the regular kit and 2 mics. Some of the instruments like djembe, concert snare drum, concert bass drum, suspended cymbal, some of those more percussion-y things, I went ahead and tracked in a more authentic and full way. So I'm not going to need to redo those this week, but I am going to have to retrack the drum set parts. Now for 2 of the 3 songs, Dan and I seem to be on the same page with my scratch drums, so I think it's just about picking out the right equipment and actually laying it down. One of them is going to take a little bit more tweaking, but at this point, with everything set up for the week, I think we'll be able to get it done, hopefully over a few days. Just heard back from Dan. He loves all 3 tracks, and we're officially ready to call this album a wrap, at least for the drums. I think that's a testament to the fact that now that we've been working together 2 months, I have a better sense of reading what I think Dan wants in a drum part on a song, even with just having acoustic guitar and vocals for most of them. So now that we're done, I need to package everything up and send it off to him. And luckily we're using the same DAW, Logic Pro, so I'm able to just send him the project file, and that's really easy for him to remove plugins, adjust EQ, various things, and he can keep all the separate takes I did neatly organized within the actual project file. If I needed to send actual stems, like waves of each mic I recorded, I'd have to make sure that I remove all the plugins, all the processing, and send everything raw. That way, whoever's mixing it has the baseline of the audio I recorded to work with. So once I got everything over to him, we did talk about the financial part of this. And my best advice for you guys is that if you want to do this, have a plan for that figured out ahead of time. If I'm working with someone I don't know, I'd probably ask for half up front. And for a project of this magnitude, I might ask to be paid in installments along the way. And that's another advantage of working in these small batches. But if I'm working with a friend, I'm usually fairly confident that I'll be paid. And so Dan did pay me within the day I sent him all of the final tracks. In these sorts of situations where I'm tracking from home, I usually do this with a rate per song. And for me, that's nice because I can work at my own pace. I don't have to feel like I'm on the clock and invoicing someone for all this time. And that way, if in the middle of 2 takes I want to run up and get lunch, answer an email, go run an errand, I can do that. If I'm working in a studio, it might be per hour, but usually it's per day. So just some different circumstances depending on how you're recording. I think doing it from home is a lot more convenient for me, the client, and probably more affordable as well. So something to consider for all of you out there. Now, I'd love to be able to share the entire album with you right at this point, but typically drums are one of the first things to get tracked. So there's going to be a waiting game before even I get to hear any of this final product. Dan did tell me his goal is to have it released by next fall of 2025. And I started working on this in the fall of 2024. So it'll be fun to go back and listen almost a year away from when I first started and remind myself of what I did in these songs. But that's just part of the waiting game, especially when you're a drummer. I hope this video was helpful to some of you out there looking to get into this sort of thing. And if you enjoyed it, leave a comment down below, like the video, subscribe to the channel. All that stuff greatly helps me out with this content I produce and encourages me to keep going and producing more. So once again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.